So welcome to the webinar on chemical strategy for sustainability. I can see we've got some people from Europe as well as people from far, far away from Europe. So we'll spend a little bit time introducing what is chemical strategy for sustainability. And I'd like to welcome here our guests. I'd like to welcome Giulia Carlini, who is working for Center for Environmental Health, CEWE. Probably many of you know her, and she has been co-authoring a report on the effects of chemical strategy for sustainability on international policy, so she will talk about that. Next, we will have Michael Warhurst, who is the director of ChemTrust, a United Kingdom NGO working on chemicals policy primarily, and he'll be talking about the effects of chemical strategy for sustainability for countries outside of the EU, because United Kingdom just recently exited from the European Union. And last but not least, we will have Frida from ChemSec, a Swedish NGO who is working primarily with progressive businesses and manufacturers on eliminating toxic hazardous substances from their supply chain. So this is our panel. And I'd like to ask Jan just to give you some information on the technical details of our webinar today.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I have just a couple of simple technical things to mention. Since this is a webinar, the Zoom doesn't allow you to speak directly. So we decided that you can write questions if you have some through the Q&A feature of Zoom, which you can see on the bottom of your Zoom screen, this Q&A. And the panelists will be answering your question during the session, but also we will come back to some of these questions after the presentations in the discussion and Q&A session. If you don't feel comfortable writing your questions, you can also wait for the debate or Q&A section at the end, and you can just raise your hand, and we will be giving floor to those of you who want to raise your questions directly. Also, if you have any technical issues, problems, questions, please let me know. You can write me directly in the chat. And I would also like to state that this webinar will be recorded, just for you to know. And that's it. I will give floor back to Carolina.
Thank you, Jan. So let me ask Giulia first. She will start the presentation on the effects of chemical strategy and sustainability on international policy. So Giulia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Could you please confirm that you can hear me well, that you can see the presentation in full screen, and even if it's changing?
Yes, it's changing. We can see it full screen and we can hear you very well. So you can go ahead and
Perfect. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction. In my 10 minutes presentation, I am going to give a very quick overview of the chemical strategy for sustainability, and then focus on the global commitments, the commitments on the global policy that we find in the strategy and what's actually needed to achieve them according to CEWE's analysis. The chemical strategy for sustainability towards a toxic-free environment is a document that was published by the European Commission last October. And it's actually composed of two sections. One is a communication, which is basically in the EU jargon, a sort of list of commitments, long-term vision for chemical policy in the European Union. And it's arising from the commitment in the European Green Deal. And so it should help achieve a toxic-free environment, which is one of the objectives of the Green Deal towards a zero pollution ambition in the European Union. And this list of commitments in the communication is followed by a document which is an action plan. And as you might see in the bottom left of the slide, it's really a list of key actions for each of the objectives of the strategy, with an indicative timeline for each action. And that's because the strategy per se is just listing objectives and commitments, but all the key actions still need to be implemented. Some of them will need legislative proposals to turn into action. And as many of you used to also international negotiation on chemicals and waste might be used to, the devil is in the detail, and we need to also look at the tiny words. So here in the action plan, we can already see the EU Commission saying that the measures presented in the action plan can be also subject to evaluation and impact assessments as appropriate. So we also want to make sure that these commitments are not delayed, because that's one of the potential concerns for the implementation of the strategy. So to recap, the strategy is a list of commitments, and the key will be turning these into action. I wanted to give you a very quick overview of the main objectives of the strategy, the 5 objectives. I'm then going to focus my presentation of the very last one, and Michael and Frida are also going to follow up on some of the others. So I'll try to go quick in here. There are 5 main objectives of the chemical strategy for sustainability. The first one is about innovation and design, with this idea of defining chemicals that are safe and sustainable by design. So starting from innovating by the design stage. There is a second objective that is about addressing the most pressing environmental and health concerns. And here I put a couple of examples of actions that fall into this objective, that are the one of banning the most harmful chemicals in consumer products in the European Union, and the one of phasing out PFAS in the EU. And both these commitments also say that they will happen unless the use of these chemicals is essential. So we also see that another of the key and challenging things to define from this strategy is the concept of essential use, that if not defined correctly, might risk being a loophole there. The third objective of the strategy is about the legal framework, and here an example of key action is about a coordination of the hazard and risk assessments on chemicals across chemical legislation. Another objective, the fourth one, is about providing a comprehensive knowledge base on chemicals in the EU. And here I put just an example of key action, which is the idea of moving towards grouping approaches for the restriction of chemicals in the EU, which is also very ambitious and very promising. The last objective of the strategy, the one I'm going to focus on, is about the role of the EU in the world. The EU presents itself as a potential role model for the sound chemicals management in the world. And it's really saying that it will set the example for the world. In this part of the strategy, under this objective, the EU Commission is actually dividing the actions into 2 main blocks. The first one is about strengthening international standards and looks at international instruments like the chemicals conventions, like the Sustainable Development Goals, and SAICM, the strategic approach to international chemicals management. And then there's a second set of commitments that refers more to the role of the European Union with third countries and what it can do to support them. With CEWE, we focus our analysis on these commitments, and as you might see, we also put them looking at the annex and the indicative timeline in this sort of visual to make sure that we can see some of these commitments should already start turning into action or should have already started towards the end of last year, while some of them are actually supposed to come in 2023 and 2024. I'm now going to go quickly to analyze some of these key commitments and the actions that are needed to achieve them. On the first type of example of actions on commitments, I've listed here some examples that relate to the EU and international fora and what will be needed to achieve them and turn them into action. The first one of the commitments of the EU in this sense is about promoting the implementation of the Chemicals Convention, and the strategy specifically lists the Stockholm, Rotterdam, and Minamata conventions. As you might see, there's one of the conventions that is missing, which is the Basel Convention. Of course, the Basel Convention is about waste, but there's a very important link between chemicals and waste issues. So one of our suggestions in making sure that the EU seriously implements this convention is not losing the link between chemicals and waste and the potential risks of toxic recycling if we recycle toxics into new products. And we saw that with actually reports from Arnica and other partners that revealed how some hazardous chemicals, including persistent organic pollutants, were found in plastic products made of recycled plastic, including toys for children. Another of the recommendations that we put for the implementation of these commitments is really making sure there are no loopholes. We saw, especially in the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants, how the EU sometimes has been promoting values that are actually concerning. For instance, on the low POPs content value, short chain chlorinated paraffins had a value proposed by the EU of 10,000 milligram per kilograms, while other countries have proposed values that are more on the range of 10 or hundreds of milligrams per kilograms. And this value proposed by the EU has actually been the worst value, the highest value proposed by a country in the history of the convention. And this is a potential loophole. And similarly, the EU Commission proposes to list PFAS also at the global level. And our suggestion is really to make sure that there are no exemptions when banning these chemicals globally. Otherwise, if we keep having exemption for use and production of these chemicals on these POPs, we keep finding them into new products. Other two commitments of the EU in its role in this global policy are about SAICM and adopting strategic objectives and targets for SAICM beyond 2020. And here we hope the EU will also go beyond and actually propose concrete actions, for instance, on issues of concern and how to address them. And also, we know that SAICM has been constantly underfunded, especially at Secretariat. And so we also suggest that the EU promotes the creation of an international fund based on the chemicals industry's contribution to make sure there's enough funding for SAICM and its Secretariat in the next years. And finally, on this part, there are also commitments on the promotion of the implementation on the UN globally harmonized system and the inclusion of new criteria in hazard classes. And here, one of our suggestions is to make sure that not only the GHS is adopted and implemented in all countries, but also that it comes with financial resources and also with the infrastructure that are legal and institutional, because implementing GHS doesn't automatically turn into sound management of chemicals and waste. And going towards the conclusion of my presentation, I also wanted to point out two other commitments that are more in the sense of the relationship of the EU with third countries and how it could help in this sense. And the EU commitments are about the promotion of the sound management of chemicals and about building capacity to assess and manage chemicals in third countries. The strategy specifically refers to an upcoming EU-Africa strategy as one of the ways these commitments could actually be implemented. And here I wanted to fly actually to our partners who are in Africa to make sure you follow up on this and look at this future strategy. Because when I was looking at it, there were several commitments and focuses on climate, but I haven't found it very strong on chemicals, actually barely referred to chemicals. So let's make sure on both sides we'll look at what's in the strategy and that chemicals are there. And finally, I wanted to point out one of the most ambitious commitments in global policy, including the strategy, which is the one of ensuring that hazardous chemicals banned in the European Union are not produced for export. And this would be really important to address double standards. We really appreciate these commitments, and we're actually not sure how this will be implemented because right now it seems that the EU Commission legal services are looking into ways to turn this into action. But our suggestion is to make sure the EU champions is promoting this approach also with other countries. So we address double standards globally. And we suggest that the EU could already champion a global ban on the production and use of highly hazardous pesticides, and that there are no double standards or loopholes with other issues too. For instance, we've seen under the Basel Convention how there's a sort of loophole for repairable products that in reality are electronic waste and are exported from the EU to a lot of African countries. And so making sure that double standards are addressed would include also addressing these if we really want to go beyond and be ambitious. This concludes my presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to point out that on our website, you find our analysis that goes through these and more of the commitments, and we just published it also in French and Spanish this weekend, so you find it in 3 languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giulia. Thanks a lot. It was really interesting. Maybe just one of my remarks here that the chemical strategy for sustainability is really ambitious. However, it seems like our IPEN agenda kind of doesn't change, but there are more windows right now opened on how to argue our points, and just really need to make sure that all these great green ambitions are then implemented into the real legislation, right? So let's move on to Michael. Michael Warhurst from ChemTrust, who's been working on chemicals policy for over 20 years. I remember him still being there when REACH was being introduced. So he's got tremendous amount of experience on how the legislation was evolving and developed. So he will give you his point of view on how other countries outside of Europe might somehow, or what they can take out of the chemical strategy for sustainability. So Michael, floor is yours.
Thanks, Carolina. I'll just set up the sharing, which hopefully will work okay.
Yep.
So it's there, good. Okay, so I'm talking about how EU chemicals regulation can be used outside the EU, on what changes the CSS will make. So I think I'll introduce ChemTrust. We have an interesting UK and EU focus. I'll talk a bit about what REACH has achieved, because I think it's quite important, now REACH has been in for quite a few years, to be clear what is available already from REACH that you don't have to wait for. The CSS and what comes next, and how you can take advantage of EU chemicals data and policies. So for ChemTrust, so we're a charity. We did originate in the UK, but we've always mainly worked at EU level. Protecting humans and wildlife from harmful chemicals. And now we have a ChemTrust Europe based in Germany, as well as ChemTrust in the UK. And it's probably worth saying that our position on what the UK should do after REACH is to copy everything in REACH and every new thing the EU does. That's what we're trying to get, which is rather similar to what Switzerland does at the moment. We work with scientists, we work with technical processors, decision makers, we work with other groups. We're very much at the science policy interface, particularly focusing on endocrine disrupting chemicals, but also on other hazardous chemicals. We have a blog and a Twitter, which goes through, we also have a slightly more populist website as well. So we have 2 ends. So if we move on to REACH itself, so REACH has been around now for more than, gosh, it's about, we're getting up to 15 years, I suppose, almost. REACH, you have to register your chemicals in REACH. If you're a company importing chemicals or making chemicals, you have to register them. There's currently, when I looked a few days ago, 23,513 substances. Some of those are mixtures, so it's not quite individual chemicals, which is great. It's great they're in there. Unfortunately, the quality of the data in the database is very variable. There is an attempt now by the chemical agency ECHA to do more checking on the data, try to improve it over the next few years to make it a better quality. But you know, the data is there in theory. In practice, it is often not so impressive. Companies have to self-classify their chemicals. They have to say if they think it has a hazard. Unfortunately, that self-classification is very poor. It tends to, they don't like classifying their chemicals as very dangerous. But then you have another process where the EU regulators can agree harmonized classifications, and these ones are more reliable. And I think what's important really is also, so you have the classification, and then the current law allows certain groups of chemicals, those are carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins, are generally banned from certain uses. So this is in the existing legislation. This is something that's often called hazard-based regulation by Americans and British people, but it's actually risk-based because it's saying don't use the most hazardous chemicals in certain uses that are subject to consumers. So, you know, cosmetics goes on your skin, pesticides go out in the environment. So it is still a risk assessment, but it's just simplified over what is often required. And as well as registration and classification and labeling, you also have had restrictions. Some chemicals have had their use banned. Others have been designated as substances of very high concern, SVHCs. And then in some cases, those have then been in the situation where companies actually have to apply to continue using them. So this has all been in current REACH. And it's important to say that most of the REACH data on chemicals is publicly available, and ECHA is gradually improving the way that data is presented. But if you are interested in finding out about a chemical, what the EU view of the chemical is, you should have a look on the ECHA site, the URL there. If you look at some of the problems with REACH, as I've said, there's a problem of poor quality and incomplete safety data. There's been very slow progress in actually controlling the use of chemicals. These restrictions and authorizations have just been way too slow. There's been a tendency of companies to move from one problem chemical to another in a group. I mean, this has been going on for decades. You can look at all the ozone depleters, they did exactly the same. But bisphenols is one example. At the moment, we produced a report a few years ago, the Toxic Soup report, about how companies are moving bisphenol A to bisphenol S and quite a lot of others. But so this is a problem, and it's now acknowledged to be a problem, which is good. And we also have the issue of mixtures is a big one, because we on the NGO side have always been concerned about mixtures, and now it's very, very clear, science is very clear that mixtures are an issue. And because we are really exposed to multiple chemicals, whether in humans or in wildlife, this needs to be addressed. We've also had much more concern about persistent and mobile chemicals like PFAS, neurotoxicity, and we've got a report on that. There's all sorts of new concerns have come in. So the response to this is this chemical strategy for sustainability. There was a big review of lots of different chemical law and came out, and it's supposed to address the deficiencies and move the focus to this idea of chemicals that are safe and sustainable by design, which all sounds very nice. Key measures within it is this important definition of the most harmful chemicals. Rather than just CMRs, we're going to move out into covering endocrine disruptors, persistent and bioaccumulative chemicals, and later immune, neurological, and respiratory toxins. And we've seen a list of jobs that the European Commission has just given the chemical agency in working out what this could mean. So that's an important step of making a larger group of chemicals subject to this idea of being most harmful. And then not only that, but also saying, okay, what we need to do is extend this approach of controls on the most harmful chemicals to cover more consumer products. For example, food contact materials, that's packaging and things, and also professional products like paints that would be used by a worker. And this is where we get back, as we've been mentioned, this idea of don't use it unless the use is essential to society. And there's going to be a huge argument about what essential means. Another important part of the strategy is increasing the use of grouping. So that will allow groups of chemicals to be looked at once. This is already happening to an extent. It's going to get increased. And they're also proposing a roadmap to accelerate restrictions on groups of chemicals with these most harmful chemical properties. And what's important about this roadmap is this can go separate from the actual changes to the law, as I'll mention. So this could be a faster way of controlling some chemicals. There's the idea of a mixture effect assessment factor in REACH. So having a default when you say this is the safety of this chemical, you put a default factor on to say, well, and in case it's in mixtures, we'll add a safety margin for that. Stronger controls on persistent and mobile chemicals like PFAS. And then this idea of defining safe and sustainable by design, which Frida will talk about as well. So this is supposed to be a positive agenda for industry. So rather than just saying how terrible chemicals are, somehow you give industry something positive to think about. So what comes next? This CSS is just a strategy from the Commission. It doesn't have any legal value in itself. It needs to be implemented. And there are two big lumps within that. One is stuff that can be done within existing laws. And this is the example of this roadmap for restrictions, which is due to appear this year. And then we'll use existing REACH processes to try and accelerate controls on chemicals, hopefully. And the others require changes to the law. And so you have laws on chemicals in food contact material, changes to REACH, changes to classification and labeling law. And all of that is going to take several years, maybe 3 years, if we're lucky to actually redo the laws, and then they'll need to be implemented. So it's not going to happen tomorrow, any of that. So I think my conclusion is that it is important for people outside the EU to take advantage of what REACH is already doing and what it's going to do. And crucially, the fact that all that chemical safety information is there, it is improving, and it should get even better over the following years. Using that data is a good way of moving forward. That's what, the EU has quite elaborate processes to establish things. We can still argue about what result they come out at, but at least, you have that data and it is generally publicly available. And then the CSS really adds a new element to the EU's precautionary approach, particularly increasing the number of chemical types, properties that are in the most hazardous definition, and then increasing the number of products where you get rid of chemicals like that. So once we can say if it's an endocrine disruptor, therefore it shouldn't be in consumer products. If it's a persistent mobile chemical, not in consumer products. And I think that is very important as something that can be argued in other countries, particularly because, if once it's happening in the EU, you'll be able to say, well, look, the economy is still working, people are still getting products despite that change. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks. And obviously, hopefully we'll send them around at the end so people can get all the links. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much for this really detailed overview of what the chemicals legislation is about and will be about, hopefully. So we'll now move on to Frida from the International Chemical Secretariat. That's our very powerful and effective NGO in Europe who is working with the progressive industries. I think one of the effects which REACH had was that some of the industries in Europe has started to looking on how to avoid all these hazardous chemicals and how to actually start changing their practices so they don't do this regrettable substitution type of practice. And so we'll hear more from Frida on how they are succeeding and what's coming next, hopefully.
Yes.
So floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolina. Can you see my window now?
Yes, we can. It's not in the presentation mode though.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll try again. Hang on. Maybe I was a bit too quick, maybe.
Yes, now it's working. So now I can see perfectly well. Yeah.
Great, very good. So thank you for inviting me, and just want to short introduction about ChemSec for those of you who don't know our organization. So we are very active on EU policy level, so try to drive the political discussion on hazardous chemicals. So the chemical strategy is something we pay a lot of attention to. And as Carolina said in the introduction, we we try to work with companies, both the one that's at the forefront, but also other companies, to challenge them and support them in driving towards substitution of the hazardous chemicals and in a more progressive chemicals management. We have also during the years developed a number of tools. I will mention some of them today to help companies to find ways to prioritize and to help them in the work to be more progressive. We also work with investors to inform investors about the chemical industry and the challenge and the problems with investing in hazardous chemicals, and how they can, what questions they could ask, and how they should sort of take on this challenge for their investments. And we have a lot of interest in the investors community the last years, which is very interesting. So coming to the chemical strategy, yes, both Giulia and Michael have said that it's a very ambitious document, and it talks about a lot of different issues, and it touches on many sort of aspects of how to regulate hazardous chemicals. And we are very happy to have this, even if there is no clear link that this will be regulation. It's still a very clear document that gives both policymakers and industry a clear direction where we are going. It focuses a lot on implementation and how to speed up, because that, as Michael said, that has sort of been the problem with REACH, that it all have been very, very slow and burdensome. So the idea is really to speed up and be more efficient in restricting or getting rid of these hazardous chemicals and support substitution. So the focus is really on the safe and sustainable by design. How can you support the front runners? And that's a bit of a mind shift in the policy area, or in the work of the Commission, who have sort of previously mainly focused, how can we maintain what we have, but shift it gradually. But now to say that, okay, we need to focus more on the ones that are moving ahead and moving towards sustainability, to give them a larger focus so that they can grow and take market shares. So there's a lot of talk actually within the chemical strategy and how to support the front runners. It's not very clear how that will actually be done. I think it's more a sort of mindset. This is what we should do, but the concrete actions will need to be developed. But for example, what is said is that funding should be available when developing alternatives, for example. So that is one that they have actually stated. So it's very clear that the focus is on hazardous properties, and that the aim is to phase out as efficient as possible the hazardous chemicals. If you can't, you should minimize and control, and the main sort of focus should be to really have safe and sustainable chemicals. And that is something that's called the toxic-free hierarchy in the chemical strategy. And I think that also makes it very clear that we should not focus on the risk approach to limit the risk. We should focus on really using good non-hazardous substances from the beginning. And that's really a shift, I think, in the message from the Commission in the EU. So the hazard assessment in the EU, it's also called generic risk assessment. It will be sort of the default how you deal with hazardous chemicals in consumer products, as Michael mentioned. And to focus on making sure that we get these hazardous chemicals out from consumer products. And then there will be exemption for use of these hazardous chemicals for the uses that are essential. And that's, of course, a very interesting but very difficult discussion. What is essential? ChemSec released a paper on this last week. So, and our idea is more or less that it depends on how you ask the question. If you talk about what is essential for you, people will say that, you know, everything in my life is essential. But if you ask someone, what is so essential in your life that you can accept the use of hazardous chemicals in products? I think people might have a few products or something that they can think of, but a lot of the consumer products, people do not want hazardous chemicals in it. So it all depends how you ask the question. So we have an idea of how that should be done within the policy work to make sure also that the idea of introducing essential use concept is to make the regulation more efficient, so that we don't discuss details and spend public resources on issues that are actually not really relevant, where we actually don't want hazardous chemicals at all. But this discussion is ongoing, and it will take a while until the Commission sort of puts its foot down on this definition, I'm sure. But for example, say the whole essential use concept was introduced in the link to the phase out of PFAS. So the chemical strategy also say that the group of PFAS should be phased out as a group and allowing only for essential use. So as Giulia also mentioned, there will be, EU is also aiming to address PFAS concern on a global scale, which is great. We also see that there are a lot of companies that are very concerned, that are like to move away from PFAS. And they are signing on to a commitment that we have launched to ask policymakers to regulate the whole group of PFAS. Because what they see is that they have a consumer demand to not have PFAS in their products, but for the moment they have difficulties in finding alternatives. So they see that if regulation for the whole group come into place, there will be innovation and alternatives available, and that is profitable for them. So therefore, they are very keen on having this regulation in place, because that will make their own commitment sort of easier. And then also safe and sustainable by design. There should be criteria to define for this, because this is throughout the chemical strategy document. You can read safe and sustainable, but what does that actually mean? I mean, in our view, it means, of course, no hazardous chemicals, but for someone else, for the industry, it might mean something else. So these criteria need to be developed. And so for safe and sustainable by design chemicals. And then there is a sustainable products initiative ongoing, also to take the sustainable aspects into account in product development. And then they will develop indicators to measure how industry are moving towards sustainability. So all these processes are ongoing, linked more or less to each other. Yes. So for the market in the EU, I think, I mean, there are all kinds of companies, of course, but the aim with the strategy is to make sort of the direction clear for the companies, and I think that that's a very good thing. And EU has had problems within the REACH authorization system, where they have focused more on the ones on the market with a large market share before, and not really been able to focus on the alternative providers and innovators. And they have sort of seen that this is a problem, and the strategy aims to change that. That's my view, or that's my thinking of it. And there are many companies that are working towards sustainability. They have high ambition to move away from hazardous chemicals, also working on climate issues and biodiversity, etc. And they have high goals set up internally. And for them to be able to really deliver on their goals, they also need a policy following this. So I think the chemical strategy is also much in line with what many EU companies are actually working towards. Not all, of course. You will always have someone sort of walking the other way, or not prioritizing this. But we can see that a lot of companies are moving in this direction. And also parts of the chemical industry. And I think that's for us working closely with dialogue and with the chemical industry, we can see a change where there are some parts of the chemical industry that are very active. So just before I wrap up, just want to show something that ChemSec has done on industry and show a industry progress. So we have something called ChemScore, where we have ranked the 35th biggest chemical companies on their chemicals management. The criteria will look at what hazardous chemicals they produce, what alternatives they produce, transparency, management, and controversies. And no one is great here. Okay, so there's a long way to go, but still we can see that there are differences, and the ones at the top are more vocal and really are more transparent and working more, have a sort of idea in line with what the chemical strategies present. So there are really differences in the chemical industry, but we also have front runners there. There's a lot of things happening within the industry, I would say. And also to mention the tools, very short what we have. So we have, because that could also be useful to know how to find ways for companies to prioritize, to be more ambitious. It could be very helpful with tools to sort of hold on to. So we have the SIN list, where we list substance of very high concern. We use the REACH criteria for substance of very high concern. And there's a list of 900 something substances that we think companies should prioritize for substitution. The ChemSec Marketplace is a platform where alternative providers can market their products, because that is what the companies are asking for. They're asking, okay, so we want to face that, but where are the alternatives? So this is a way to boost that change and to give the alternative providers extra space to market their products. And ChemScore I mentioned, and the other ones I think I leave for you to look into our website to find out. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Frida, for the great presentation. So now we've got about 15 minutes for questions and answers. If you want to, you can raise your hand, and Jan will give you the floor by letting you speak. And if you can introduce yourself and also the organization and country you're from, that would be helpful. And I think we've got one question in the chat. So Jan, if you want to read it out.
Yeah, meanwhile, I can read the question, or rather a comment from Semia, who is IPEN hub for MENA region. She writes, the countries aren't related only to the EU, but also to the World Trade Organization and World Customs Organization, which have more power specifically on third countries. So if a substance is banned in EU, doesn't mean that it is automatically banned in third countries, as these organizations will call the country to show the risk. And we know that the third countries don't have the capacity to do so. What is needed is to have a harmonization of action between the entities that have power in the world, and working on EU towards third countries isn't sufficient and will not resolve the problem in our countries.
I can say something.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously in the ideal world, it would be world controls on chemicals. And obviously there are a few treaties there, like on POPs. I mean, the biggest problem is generally that the US in particular and other countries really block any sort of significant controls on chemicals. The US industry is very powerful in the US, and it's even more powerful once you get onto foreign and trade policy. So it is extremely difficult to get much at a global level. And the EU, I mean, the great thing about having an EU control on something is it provides a scientific basis as to why the control is needed, and it provides the evidence that it's possible to substitute it. But clearly that's not enough to generate change at different levels. I mean, it is worth saying that obviously the EU is also part of those organizations. The EU does get challenged at WTO and does defend its position in general. So, but yeah, global level is difficult. So I think it's very difficult. I mean, you know, maybe the Biden administration will be better than, well, the Trump administration, but our experience in general is that even apparently good US administrations are still pretty terrible when it comes to international agreements.
Thank you, Michael. Would anybody else like to comment on it? Frida, go ahead.
I think, I mean, you're totally right that this doesn't change for the rest of the world, but I mean, hopefully EU can be a role model, and if the EU would be able to show that it's also possible for a market shift, that the market can actually, you know, produce safe and sustainable chemicals or better alternatives, and show that it's possible from a socioeconomic perspective. I think that is a very good argument for other countries to move in the same direction. And also the larger companies that, in my eyes, have a sort of large commitment on these issues, because that's a branding issue for them. Also to have a brand with consumers feel good about, but also their employees feel good about. I like working at this company. I think that's more and more important for young people. I think that could also, you know, influence more around the world. Hopefully, that's what we hope for, of course.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we will be really glad to hear if there's an issue of double standards, especially for some of these really global companies. So we're happy to hear it, because I think it's easier from our European point of view to kind of target them and tell them this is not the way to go. So I think some kind of a collaboration also would be beneficial here. Giulia, you want to comment on it?
Thanks. Yeah, very quickly, totally support what Michael and Frida already said. And indeed, if the EU really manages to implement the commitment of not exporting the chemicals that are already banned in the EU, that will already be a great signal. And so, yeah, having that example will help. Also wanted to, say something similar to what Michael said on the fact that EU itself is challenged at the WTO by other countries, often the US, when it takes measure restricting chemicals in the EU. So in some sense, we also face those challenges in the EU, but of course, double standards remain an issue. We had that even within Europe, between Western and Eastern Europe, sometimes where we see double standards in products. So I hope we can continue highlight that, because I also think our pressure can also help highlighting that that's not okay.
I see that Dorota from Healthcare Without Harm is raising her hand, so you can go ahead with your question.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So I do have actually a question, more like would like to hear your reflections on alternatives, because of course, I mean, we need to phase out many hazardous substances, and we need alternatives. And the point is that those alternatives have to be good and safe. And as we all know, actually, Michael said it very clear, that's a history of very bad, regrettable substitution. So what do you think, what will be the mechanism that we can better ensure that the alternatives that will be now coming on the market, that there will be really those that are safer? Thank you.
Can I start?
Frida, yeah, Frida, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's a very relevant question. And I think that clarity for industry makes it easier. And for industry, is not economically beneficial really in the long run to shift to an alternative that is not a long-term alternative. It might be a fast, quick and an easy solution, but in the long run it's not beneficial for them. So I think if we have clarity on what chemicals we like to phase out, and also you use a grouping approach more efficiently, it will be more sort of better alternatives. I think that, I mean, we have seen some really bad substitution, definitely, but I think from a company perspective, overall that's not really what they want.
Michael?
Yeah, quickly from me. I mean, I think grouping is very important. And I think we're also in an interesting situation now as REACH matures, because there is this commitment to look at all the chemicals to some level using grouping and other techniques, computer-based modeling. And the ECHA has this project called the Chemical Universe Project, and they are trying to classify all chemicals or registered chemicals into different groupings as to whether they need regulatory action. Looks like they don't need regulatory action at the moment. They need more data. And I think as that process moves forward, you get more and more chemicals have at least been examined, and it becomes a bit clearer to industry which ones are in the we've looked at them but they don't need regulatory action category. So I think a combination of grouping and that over the next few years is going to be quite significant. And that's why I think it is really useful to focus people's attention in the rest of the world into what is going on in the REACH system and in ECHA. Because with this approach, the EU is moving a very long way ahead of other systems in the world, other databases, other governments. And it's not going to be perfect, but it is an awful lot further ahead to actually be really reviewing all the chemicals you have registered. That's a significant step beyond so many systems which depend on some prioritization process and then hardly do anything with the priority chemicals. You're muted.
Thank you. Just to add on this, we had a discussion last week, really interesting one on essential uses. And I think the one thing which came out of it was that a lot of the chemicals we're using in products specifically are not actually essential, and that very often you can live without them, even without substituting them. That, let's say in cosmetics, you don't have to have, so many perfluorinated chemicals, carcinogenic chemicals, because there will be maybe less kinds of certain type of a product, but with less hazardous chemicals. And I think many of us can live without those very, very easily. And there are so many, specific uses of chemicals which are really non-essential. And that's another key which needs to be communicated, sometimes also toward the legislators, that the substitution is also like really seeing where the chemical is essential use and where it's non-essential use. Yeah.
I see that Semia is raising her hand, so I'm giving her the floor. Semia.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Thank you for all the panelists and this really very important session. So regarding the alternatives, what I would like to add is for the industries, they are interested about the competitive prices regarding that means the substitution. So that's, I think, very, very important, because whenever we don't have the effective price of the alternatives, so the industry will not listen to you. Thank you.
Frida, you want to?
Yes, yes, that's true. And I think, you need both the carrot and the whip, sort of say, so that to have that the legislation in place also is very clear on that, what you accept and what you don't accept. And of course, economic part is difficult if an alternative is much more expensive and there are no incentives. And even if it's actually the same price, it's difficult for some companies to move because they are used to something, and change is always, a bit scary. So definitely it needs to be clarity and also legislative measures. Not, I mean, the strategy is just a start. So we need stricter regulation in place to make sure that this shift is happening, definitely.
Thank you. So I don't see any hands and any questions. We've got the last 2 minutes. Anybody would like to have a last remark or question? Semia, go ahead. You're muted. Or
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So just to give you the example of the double standards, for example, in Tunisia, 2 examples. So for lead and paint and the double standards on talc. So we face a big problem. Even the Ministry of Trade are really interested to phase down the talc Johnson & Johnson, but they said the World Trade Organization will not allow us like automatically for that, because if it is coming from other countries, so we will need to show the risk. That's one. And we don't have these capacities to show the risk and a study or survey for that. So that's it is likely over all the third countries. So that's something that we should highlight. Also for the lead and paint, to build on Frida recommendations. So for example, for lead and paint, we are now working in Tunisia on the law, so to ban the lead in paint and other like cadmium and other substances. But now facing, so the industries are in a crisis related to the COVID, so we cannot, because the prices are very high. So we will like make a restriction on just lead and some other substances. So that's what we have to take in account. And we would like, that means to have the same as EU, like working on, and to be like over the world the same, but we have all the time the barriers, and we have to fight under the international convention to be like harmonized everywhere on in this regard. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the comment, Michael.
I mean, just briefly on that, it is a big problem. WTO is a constant problem. I think the EU has the advantage of lots of lawyers, and they have, if they're in the mood, they can challenge sort of. I remember when REACH was being created, there was I heard about this idea that, you know, WTO isn't really black and white. It's much more complicated than that. There's a lot of grey areas, and so the EU is, I think, able to use those grey areas more than maybe a small country is, with less expertise. But, you know, ultimately, I think if the EU has done something, the EU is also having to justify that at WTO. The EU publishes its plans at WTO, it gathers comments on them. So if the EU has done it, then it, in the EU's view, it is allowed with WTO. So you can say, well, the EU lawyers view this as WTO compliant. And the other thing with the WTO is that WTO is quite dysfunctional, and the actual enforcement mechanisms in WTO are extremely weak and largely ineffective. So in some ways, it's a bit of a theoretical threat anyway. But I think, you know, if the EU says it can be done, then I would say you try and push for your country to do it as well, or any country to do it, because the EU has lots of trade lawyers.
Thank you very much. So I guess that's been our last remark. Thank you to all of the participants and for all the questions, and thanks to all of the panelists for great presentations. We'll be distributing the presentations and the recording as well soon. Ian will take care of it. And we'll be looking forward to meet you again at one of our next webinars. So thanks a lot and have a great rest of the day.